Hey friends, today's show is really different from any other episode of the podcast. If you like it, maybe I'll be able to do some longer form conversations with more original thinkers in the future. I hope it's a little different than almost anything that you've listened to, because today's show is two brothers, two siblings, talking about a wide range of issues, ideas, and experiences. Mainly, it's me interviewing my big brother, Brian Dominick, who has a brand new, what we call novella out called Present as Prologue. That's available under Brian Dominick at Amazon.com. My brother is 2.5 years older than me, and we are, well, I think it's fair to say quite different in almost every way possible. He has for most of his life been a non-conformist in my term, weird as he refers to himself, and while I haven't led the most traditional path through life, I do have the wife and kids and home in the suburb situation like a lot of other Americans. Brian and I talk about the Catholic Church we attended and why we hated it. Then we discuss his very, very early introduction to drugs and alcohol and how he became an addict and got kicked out of the house. We discussed how he was radicalized politically and how he came to so many of the moral views that he has. And of course, we talk about his ideas on revolution, how it starts in your home and your work, and why he always has wanted to see radical systemic change in our nation, our society. At one point, Brian gets kind of too emotional when talking about his very difficult adolescence, and we change gears. As the younger sibling, I was just watching my brother step in shit and took a different path when necessary, but I've also been heavily influenced by his moral compass, especially when it comes to anti-racism and feminism and what he refers to as the political economy. And when I listened to this conversation that we had, I also learned a lot about myself, I think, as a parent, and how you have no idea why your children might go down the road and paths that they go down. I actually just got a message from a longtime listener on Twitter who said that she lost her son this year to suicide, her 16-year-old son, and she had no idea why he hung himself. And obviously that is so dramatic and so horrific and tragic, but the idea that you wouldn't know why is even more terrifying. So when listening to my brother talk about why he might have made the choices and why he might have gone down the paths he went down, it made me think a lot about my daughters and how I might create opportunities and disrupt certain other paths that they might go down. So hopefully you'll take something from it, even as a parent as well. I'm really curious as to what you think about this conversation, and I hope that you get as much out of it as I certainly did having it. And Brian's novella is 90 pages long. It's called Present as Prologue, a Gen Zero novella. It's available on Amazon. He doesn't have a huge network to market it to, but I do. And since he's been behind me as a silent partner in almost every part of my career and my life, I'm happy to try to help him promote this labor of love that he has finally completed. So please go to Amazon and consider buying it. 99 cents on Kindle or $6.90 in paperback. And if you're new to the podcast, please rate it 5 stars. If you haven't posted a review, please consider it. I can't create this show 3 times a week without your support on Patreon. So consider a subscription there at patreon.com/Pete Dominick. Here now is my conversation with my big brother at Brian Dominick. Congratulations on your novella, bro.
Thank you.
How does it feel to have it done and have a cover on it? And
it's the first thing that I've published, and even though I self-published it, the gratification was definitely in completing it and putting a cover on it, which I also designed myself, but I'm kind of proud of.
How long have you been writing?
I guess since the 3rd grade. I've been writing short stories since the 3rd grade, when I wrote a mystery about something that happened in a cornfield, and definitely was resolved by some kind of Deus Ex Machina. I invented a device that helped them figure out the mystery. It was really bad.
Why did you start writing at such a young age?
Because Mrs. Farsler, my teacher at the time, really encouraged me. Yeah,
For a teacher,
I think despite how she knew we were whispering behind her back, she was still super encouraging. And it was maybe the first time someone pointed out that I had a unique talent or something.
What is it? Have you done self-analysis on what makes your point of view so radical since you were a little boy? Like you never fit in. Your brain never thought the way other kids' brains done. You never really conformed. Have you done?
Yeah, I mean,
why is that?
Well, okay, I haven't gone back that far as to figure out why I'm so weird, but I've definitely done a ton of therapy. So I definitely can trace a few of my behaviors back, but I don't think that's mostly what you're talking about. Like why I think differently and always have was because for some reason the counterpoint made a lot more sense to me in a lot of cases, and I just knew to listen. Like there just always seemed to be another way to look at things, whether it was right or wrong, but that no one was paying attention to. So the idea that when we would play G.I. Joe, I decided that Cobra had some good grievances. I mean, that was in my own mind, right? But I was like, let's find a different way to play this, because I'm not trying to be evil. I'm just trying to like have some kind of angle to what Cobra Commander is after and, you know, what these guys are up to. That
was my earliest thoughts about that there was something wrong with you, because why would you want to play the bad guy? You always wanted to be Cobra, and I always, of course, wanted to be G.I. Joe.
Well, if you look back at U.S. history, I think it bears me out. Probably other than
I know, but
other than ISIS or something, which probably is the actual analog, right? So, okay, kudos to the people that invented G.I. Joe and kind of this evil organization to fight. But for the most part at that time, and for the most part all the way up till now, most of our enemies have had a much more of a point than Cobra was portrayed as having.
Even if I granted your Howard Zinn approach, you didn't know that then. Like you didn't.
Yeah.
That wasn't your point of view wasn't based on culture.
Right, I wasn't like,
even,
no, they're really humanitarians or they're really just fighting for their nation. I didn't have that articulation. I think I just had the openness to like think differently, and someone had to play Cobra.
Yeah, but you always wanted to be. I felt like you always wanted to be Cobra.
Yeah.
And
they had the AK-47 was their primary rifle. It seemed.
Was there a book or a person that influenced you at a young age to make you be so counterintuitive, or what did you say, to counter the norm?
Well, somehow I climbed on board with satire a lot in my life. I don't know if you ever realized this, but like my first favorite book was called Bang Bang You're Dead. I think it's out of print now, but like it's a children's book about kids who basically go to war because they escalate their daily kind of like gun oriented play to real violence and would hurt each other at the end of it. But I was kind of fascinated by that whole thing. And I was really interested in this idea that like our actual play or the way that we interacted had kind of these real world themes.
You and I or people?
Yeah. Well, probably people, but at that age, you know, me and you and our friends,
right.
I think I might have been thinking about stuff on a deeper level sometimes just because I kind of saw themes to what we were doing when we were playing cops and robbers or shooting games. I was always trying to make them more elaborate and more complex.
Right.
And everyone was
Dungeons and Dragons.
Exactly. So I was always trying to add these dimensions to things. And I think that on some level, you know, my natural mind is just weird enough that I've been able to have people think, well, that's just creative. And I'm like, well, that's just what my mind does when I put any thought to it.
Second time you've used the word weird, and I'm not sure, I feel like I've not ever really heard you use the word weird. When you think of that word and reference to yourself, how do you define it?
Yeah, it's been pretty lately that I've done this. I mean, I think I might have been weird my whole life, and I never really thought of it that way. But you put it, I don't know, you started it because you say I think differently. I think that's really true. It's not like, oh, I think so specially, but I don't know a lot of people I don't talk to people on a regular basis. I can't find people that think the way I do. And I go through the world thinking that, and maybe everybody does, but
everybody doesn't.
Okay.
But I've
been wondering, so thanks for clearing
Well,
that up.
I mean, we'll break it down in terms of what you think and how you think and why you think about it as we talk about your book and all of everything that you put into it, why you wrote it. But I always use the word, and still do, in describing you as just a nonconformist. You were always a nonconformist, especially at the times when it mattered most. You were more of a conformist probably in your grammar school years. You were more, quote, normal in terms of your outward appearance and behavior. but then you certainly were always rebellious. But then in junior high, and especially in high school, you were really different. You dressed differently, you talked differently, you thought differently, and you certainly acted differently. And you were rebellious. You didn't, obviously, you hated authority.
Yeah, so that's the first thing. I hated authority. I hated religion very early. Like I never...
Oh, we got to talk about that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's pretty core probably, because I think maybe here we have something, right? I definitely thought everybody, you, mom and dad, and I think they might have been, pretending. Everybody was pretending. I thought the whole world was pretending. I even kind of thought the priests were pretending to believe in this weird story that seemed on the face of it to not possibly be true. Partly because I was misunderstanding things too. I didn't really get what people were even trying to say. I didn't understand the Bible in its literal sense, even, or not this literal sense, but in any kind of, reasonable understanding of it. I thought some of the prayers had totally different words in them than they did. I thought the fruit of your womb, Jesus, was the fruit of the looms. I thought it was referring to the shroud that he had on the crucifix. And I really believed it and thought they're punking us. Why would they say fruit of the looms, like his underwear? Why would they refer to that?
That's
so some of my misunderstandings were, the root of me thinking this was all crazy, but it was mostly the real stuff that, like Noah.
Right.
That was even weirder
I think
than an underwear reference.
All kids have limited vocabulary, and so they attach certain meanings to things. And I remember thinking that along the lines of religion is one of the few examples I have. And mom used to tell us, we're going to church, don't wear your holy pants.
Yep.
I thought she meant pants that were sacred.
Yeah. I know.
That were
blessed. You telling me this before. I love
not
that.
pants that had holes in them, which is way more obvious.
I think I might have thought that too. I can't tell if you sort of like put that in my head later or when we were kids.
So
but yeah.
let's stick with this religion thing for a while. Let's explain to people listening, the millions, that what our religious upbringing was. Basically, there was no talk of it at home. There was Sunday church, and we were forced to go to religious education, or some people call it, I guess, catechism or Catholic school, where basically it would be maybe once a week after school. And
on campus, on a little cutout corner of our public school campus that they sold to the Catholic Church in order to have a legal church and state separation. Did you realize that?
No.
That little building we went to every day.
No. Huh.
They sold that to the Catholic Church, or maybe, I don't know if it already was.
But they were feeding us in there pretty good.
They were setting us straight over a little path from our public school to theirs. You couldn't tell from looking outside that there wasn't the same campus.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah.
So
it's gross.
But there was at some point where you just told Dad, because Mom didn't care. Mom was, first of all, not Catholic.
Yeah, I don't think she really believed any of that. She certainly didn't believe Catholicism.
She never talked about God or religion.
Right.
Us.
So
Dad didn't either. He just brought us there.
Yeah.
Dropped us off at that hellhole. And
he would.
us and
they would go to mass with us, except during ski season.
Right. Which was also an inconsistent lesson.
It was a perfect lesson that this was bullshit. I took it as exactly on its face value of this guy doesn't really care. He's going skiing.
He did it.
And he was like, at certain times he would, but I mean, he would take Sundays and that was a huge commitment, but it was for Nana. It was for our grandmother.
Exactly.
That's for his mom.
Right. That's why we went. A lot of people do that for their parents. They just can't.
Yeah. And that bothered me.
How did you...
It seemed like those were hours stolen from my life. That was horrible. I hated every minute of Catholic everything.
Hold the mic a little closer to your mouth. Yeah.
Yep. I hated every minute of all the Catholic stuff. I didn't like any of it. I didn't fall for any of it. It didn't seem good to me. It wasn't fun. I didn't like dressing like a very plain person and shaking everybody's hand, whether I wanted to be there or not.
Right.
Like none of it. Not a bit of it. And it all felt like stolen time of my childhood.
You did.
After I was already had my time stolen being shipped off to that awful school 5 days a week.
Well, the clencher was a saving grace.
And there was a gentleman who would always be in front of us somehow, even though we tried to randomly choose a seat. I think we were too late to be pickers, and this is probably the explanation, bro. We were always late and everybody else was not getting behind the clencher, but then we would get behind this guy who would suck his pant bottom into his butt cheeks.
It looked like his ass was breathing.
His ass breathed, as far as we could tell, and we had to not laugh, and we were us.
Pure joy.
It was pure pain. because it was the funniest thing that's ever happened, and we couldn't sing it. Like, we had to sing about boring stuff instead of
sing.
Can you imagine? No, right, I wasn't. But like, can you imagine if I'd had a hymn about the clencher?
So, do you remember when you seem to remember everything? Do you remember when did you go to Dad and be like, I'm out of here. I'm not going to religious. I'm not going to Catholic
first
school.
I was just like, I don't want to go to church, right? And I didn't have much of a case. But then a while into Catholic school, I started complaining. But I also started acting out, right? So I had to talk to that priest that ran that place a couple times because I would challenge stuff in the class. I would just like in regular school, I was kind of a class clown / antagonist. I was like, what's going on with this stuff, And the other kids, to their credit, were probably like, dude, just shut up so we can all get through it. I now see that, but at the time I was like, you fools, and I wanted to save everyone from the ignorance or something. And I don't know, 6th grade.
Was there then a conversation with Dad about I'm not going to Catholic school anymore?
Yeah, but I don't remember most of them until the final one when I was supposed to enter the school for what's that last thing you do? Confirmation. And I really didn't want to go. And then he said, you'll get a few $1,000s out of it if you go through it. And I just stared at him and waited. And I go, are we done now? Because he had tried to bribe me and I still wasn't in. And he was like, okay, fine. And he let me off the hook that easily. Like, he mentioned money one time when I didn't buy into it. He was like, I'm not going to make the kid
because
do it.
He didn't buy into it himself. He didn't really care about it.
He didn't. And then they kind of told us later that they didn't sit around talking about how important it was to bring us to church for our souls. They talked about among themselves probably what to do family wise. And I'm somewhat sympathetic to that because I see people from cultures where the religion is important now. I see young people who actually appreciate that. And, if it felt like ethnicity to me, maybe I'd feel like there's some reason to do it, but man, did it feel like boring, white, plain, old.
Scary.
Yeah, creepy.
Yeah.
It's a death cult. I hadn't heard that at the time, but I've heard atheists say that since. It's a death cult.
Catholicism or religion?
Yeah, Catholicism. Like, that dead guy was up there on that cross every day. We were children. That's awful.
It's interesting that you say if there was something that was ethnically attached to it, like Jews or Muslims or...
Yeah, because our parents didn't care. So there's no way to get an ethnic attachment out of it. I'm not saying that you can't have an ethnic Catholic.
Right, there's Irish and Italian Catholic.
Right, sure. Yeah. And we could have been one of those, but we weren't. Right. So I didn't have any of those threads there.
That's a good point. I thought about that.
I think maybe Nana did, right? Like,
Nana's our grandmother. It was our Italian grandmother.
Yeah, she was introduced to that in a different context, in a different time, and it was of support for her. And late in her life, she went every day to Mass.
Right.
So that was... We were different people.
You can always go back.
Yeah, I've looked into it.
I don't think you have.
The reconversion plan is not beneficial.
So that was, I think that's an interesting kind of example story about your own rebellion and not buying into, in this case, religion, but you also never really bought into school.
Yeah, I could tell that was bullshit the whole way. And I actually made that argument to our parents, why this was not the way that I needed to be educated, I think, at a certain point in high school. I mean, I really was mostly checked out by then, but I did have a real-time critique of, like, this is not the way to teach this brain these things that you want to teach it.
Did you think you were highly intelligent and that...
No, I thought I was on a track that was very narrow, probably, and that... I knew in high school, I need a way to be able to have a creative outlet and make a living. And it's not going to be through college. I'm never going to make it through college. Like, it never crossed my mind that I should go to college. I did try.
Why not? Because college is so much different in high school and you're so much more in control of your actual education and the classes you pick. And
I think, yeah, and I went to community college the first...
You went for like 2 weeks.
First semester. Oh, no, I did a semester and I got straight A's. Straight A's. It was super boring and easy because suddenly we were paying for it. But yeah, I mean, that was between when I was doing a lot of drugs as a kid. So I started using again in the break between those semesters. So I did drop out of community college halfway through the second semester.
I think it would be really interesting to talk about your drug use before, again, we get to...
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
Laying down a kind of basis for who you are and how you arrived at the person you became is interesting to talk about before we get to the novella, which is your drug use. You did something like...
I'm also an expert in what you were like when you were a kid. So
nobody cares.
Okay.
Pretty boring. I mean, pretty normal.
I'd have things to say, but it's your show.
Well, maybe another time. I don't mind.
We'll see what listeners think.
People who listen at SiriusXM or even to some extent at the podcast probably know a lot about me already. So,
sure.
And I'm more about learning about other people.
But you also maybe have a different perspective than I do
on
your own childhood.
Oh yeah, sure.
Anyway,
it's so. My understanding is that you started with drugs and alcohol. The first thing you did was like huffing gasoline or something like that?
No, glue.
Glue?
Yeah.
At what age?
Model glue and rubber cement at a pretty early age, actually.
It got you high?
It did. It kind of took me out of the world for a little while. A
little while being?
30 seconds or 2 minutes.
Really?
Or I don't really know at this point. Every time was different.
What age?
7 or 8.
And then what? And how often would you do that?
I did it when it was around, and I didn't crave it or seek it out when it wasn't. But sort of when I would start working on a model or something, I would kind of get reattracted to it, and I would usually huff it like once or twice to kind of escape. It gave me bloody noses, which Mom decided was me picking my nose, which I just kind of let her believe.
You knew it was because you were sniffing?
Well, I suspected, yeah. And I think maybe the doctor asked me something. I don't think he asked me if I did that, but he might have asked me if I'd put anything up my nose or something. I kind of remember being at the doctor with this bloody nose thing and that kind of coming out.
What was next?
Alcohol.
When? First drink?
11 was the first time I got drunk. Mom and I don't know if you were part of this, but Mom and Dad's friends used to give me sips, quite a lot of sips of usually hard liquor at parties, quite because I would run up and ask them to, and they would never kind of know that someone else had just done that. It was really, I don't know if you remember those parties, but Mom and Dad partied pretty hard. Their friends partied really hard.
Yeah, they always had a lot younger friends, like 10 years younger.
Yeah, and they were ski instructors, they were athletes or whatever,
softball and skiing.
Yeah, and they were fun people and they were great to us, and none of them would have ever gotten me drunk at that age, but a few of them found it funny to let me and a couple of the other kids, I won't name any names, but kids our age, who would serve. We used to pour out of the keg at the bar, in the back room of the bar at the ski resort, because we were the ski instructor's kids, so we had all this access to these things.
So the first time you got drunk was at 11? The
first time I did it, like knowing that was my mission, was 11 with our family members
and
at
then
a party that you were also at.
Really? I was there?
Yeah.
And then what?
Yeah, you were there, but didn't know somehow. I mean, you just didn't. You were just too young.
I was 9.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I didn't even know what alcohol probably did.
Yeah, although our cousin was younger and drank. So two of our other cousins.
What was
younger than you, or your age and younger?
When did it become something that you sought out, or something that you even did on a regular basis? And then of course, when did you try something?
After that, I was pretty into it. There was only 11? A few drinks of vodka that night when I was 11, but I got in trouble for it. Others got in more trouble for it. The whole party got busted, and somehow I was kind of hooked on that idea.
Drinking?
Of breaking rules. It was fun. They also pierced my ear that night. Our older cousins pierced my left ear that night. We put a Band-Aid over it and told Mom that I cut it or something. And then I took the Band-Aid off and was at the party being all cool. Yeah, this is a thing that actually happened.
Wow.
When I was 11, and it was the greatest thing that had ever happened to me. I was like a cool kid. I had a broken toe or an injured toe from earlier, and I couldn't feel it because a couple drinks. And then it all came down, and somehow maybe even the fact that our parents kind of like broke it up, or, Mom and her family is who was there actually. And those adults kind of like called it to a halt. It was in the backyard at Grandma's house, and I enjoyed the whole thing. And I was into it.
And then after that, you did it on your own, alone, with friends, and just drinking?
I did it in all ways, including alone sometimes at a pretty early age.
Where did you get alcohol? Mom and Dad didn't have hard alcohol.
They did. You didn't even know. They had it in the basement. So on several occasions, I would drink really disgusting things that were down there, including a cherry liqueur that I was just gross enough to do it. Like, I had a problem at a real early age.
Did you know
that I would
it?
seek this out. No, I didn't know it until a therapist that I had been going to just told me. And then,
well, when did you start seeing a therapist?
I think when I was 14, I think I scared mom and dad, just things that I would say and like just how different I was, and they didn't feel like they could talk to me, I think. And they thought maybe if we pay someone to do it, I don't think that's a bad, and I'm not critiquing this. Actually, I don't think that they could talk to me.
And as we progressed with drugs?
Yeah, and then, it was skateboarding and snowboarding, and I got exposed to drugs that way. Not that that's necessarily a special way to do it. It could be a good way of all the ways you're going to get exposed. There was a lot of good people in those circles, but there were worse and worse people in those circles, and I got in more and more trouble and, spent a lot of time out of the house and then got kicked out of the house for 6 weeks and really leaned into it during that period.
Why did you get kicked out?
I got in a...
How old were you?
I was 16.
After high school?
No, I was 16.
You were in high school and you got kicked out of the house?
Yeah.
I thought that was after high school. So
no.
How could you be kicked out of the house while we were in high school?
It was during my Regents exams of junior year in high school. Yeah.
So it was right before summer.
You were there. I mean, you remember this incident. You're just misplacing the time.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, it was right before summer. I think, you probably don't remember, I don't know, bro. I don't, there's a lot here, like that was a rough summer, including the girl who had been my first girlfriend. I don't want to say her name, but, I can say her first name was Amy. And she died.
I do remember that. In a car accident.
Right then.
In a car accident.
Yeah, in a car accident outside my workplace.
You weren't dating her at that point, but
no, I wasn't. But she had come back into my life, because I was distracting her in study hall when she should have been studying for these really important exams that everyone was talking about, and I was too anxious to study and didn't give a shit. And her friends used to admonish us for, not studying, and they would kind of like really tell me like, you need to leave her alone. They'd said things like, not everyone is going nowhere. Like some of the cruelest things that anybody ever said to me were said by her friends because I was distracting her in that study hall and she was laughing her ass off and we were flirting. And she died that weekend on a Saturday, if I'm remembering this right. I mean, it'd be interesting to actually look back, but my recollection is that I skipped work that day for nefarious reasons, to go get drunk or something. And she died in a horrendous car accident outside the window that I stared at that workplace.
Right.
So I would have seen it if I'd been there. And that was just kind of a lot, like I just couldn't understand.
I can't imagine,
that she died. I mean, I obviously had nothing to do with her death in any way, but how did I sort of like decide that I was going to pick her to distract of all people? Why did I do that? I don't even know.
Well, you had dated her before that.
Okay.
I mean, she was your ex-girlfriend.
But her friends were kind of right, Well, she was going somewhere. She was a great student.
Yeah, but
she probably would have aced the Regents anyway, is what I think, and whatever. But that made that whole year just different for me.
Never thought about how her death affected you.
I couldn't go to her memorial. I didn't. And then I felt awful.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I couldn't go because I was angry at her friends and I was angry at the world, and I was drunk and stoned. And
you've been kicked out of the house.
And this was right after a very good friend of mine, his brother was murdered. I don't know how much you remember about this, but this kid that I was hanging out with a lot at that time, we were confidants of each other, and he turned to me when this happened. His brother was kidnapped and brutally murdered in Florida when we were friends, and that freaked me out, and I did not handle it right, and I didn't go to that memorial either. I went and got high and drunk.
Sounds like you handled it right. Well, I mean, I don't know how you're supposed to handle.
I wasn't able to be there for that friend who... I think he was okay. He had friends. He wasn't a loser. He had a ton of friends. He was great. I didn't understand why he wanted to be mine, but these were the things that compounded, right? Like I made a poor choice. I didn't make the right decision and go and like do the right thing. And you go and you show up for your friend, even if you're just 16. I knew, right? Our dad did one thing right, in our life, which was he demonstrated that you show up for people in situations like that.
Yeah.
And I think that was a simple lesson that I knew was a right lesson. I don't think I yelled at Dad about ever going to every wake, that he ever got invited to or heard about. But it wasn't like a thing where I transgressed, but then I couldn't do it when the time came. And then I drank more because I felt guilty and I felt awful. And I lost a friend because I was ashamed of how I responded to his brother getting murdered. It wasn't about me. It wouldn't, but I made it about me by turning it into my problem.
Eventually, we did an intervention. You went to rehab, and then you haven't had a drink since.
Yeah, that's correct. Except for by accident when a bartender tried to serve me one, but I spit it out. But that's literally how far I've come from having a drink. Yeah.
You got clean at 18?
Yeah, I was 18 years old, halfway through.
How do you look back at that?
That was great. That was the best decision. I probably got too clean, but it probably was important.
Too clean?
Yeah, cannabis maybe was a drug too far, but...
to kick that out?
Well, there was no program for it, so no one at that time was saying, here's how you use cannabis to get off of alcohol. I did do that. I did use cannabis to detox from alcohol at that point. I did quit on my
purpose?
own. Yeah, I quit before the intervention. You wouldn't remember this, but I had actually
pot out at the intervention. I remember you pouring it the first time I ever saw it.
Yeah.
You poured some out.
That's funny, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Man, I had it a lot when we were kids. You never saw it.
Never saw it.
I had it stashed everywhere. You didn't go through my room?
No, I found your throwing stars.
Well, that's a different story for another day.
And a body once, but I don't want to talk about that. So when you say that was a great thing, it's because it had gotten so bad and it affected you so negatively. Was it hard to quit drinking?
Yeah. The actual time that I finally quit was probably the third time, that I tried. I mean, when I was 16, I quit for over a year and I didn't really use much.
That's right.
I had kind of a whole life my senior year of high school, but then when I went back to college, so going back to that story, halfway through that second semester, I picked up some alcohol knowing full well what I was doing. And I kind of dove headfirst into it. I think about a week later, sat Mom and Dad down when they got home from work one night and just told them, I'm moving out. I've got boxes. So-and-so are coming over to pick me up. Here's where I'm going to be. Here's the phone number. I'm going to use drugs. I don't want to lie and do all that stuff this time. It was really bad when I used to do that. So I've been doing it for a little while and I'm going to just probably just go do it full on. I told them this.
How'd they handle it? Do you remember?
I mean, they were really scared and they were really upset and I didn't know what else to do, but I thought, I guess the polite thing to do is lie to your family and stuff, but that wasn't really what I wanted to do at that point. It felt, and I lied a lot after that point, honestly, from that point on, I just lied and lied about how well I was doing and these jobs that I was getting when really I was dealing drugs and just doing stupid favors for people and the jobs were not good. And, I was barely making it. Living in Auburn, New York, just not, and I did that hard for half a year. And then, you all staged an intervention. I went to rehab and that was how that route went. And
when did you start getting away from the drugs and alcohol and, a lot of the personal, it's really fascinating hearing you talk about it. To me, I'm sure it is even to complete strangers. A lot of people probably can relate in many different ways, but I wanted to also talk about your kind of your self-informal education in kind of radical ideologies. I
think that started immediately at rehab. So it is a perfect place to pick up.
Okay, great.
At rehab, I'll tell you the story that I tell people that want to understand how I became someone who stands up for people. It started in rehab because there was a whole really diverse group of people there. And there were black people and there were queer people and there were lots of women and there was lots of epithets going around in different circles that I was extremely uncomfortable being there at all. I was the youngest person at the rehab the entire time that I was there.
They had to make a decision whether they should put you in the 18 and under or the kind of adult. And they thought because of the analysis that you were and a more mature side, a more intellectual side. So they put you with the adults, but that still meant you were the youngest.
Which was a good idea because I later got a look at that juvenile rehab and it was a total mess.
But it's also a good idea because of what you were going to say before I interrupted you about like what.
Yeah, I needed that space. That was a life-changing decision. Whoever made that decision, like that would have been either definitely death for me or definitely or possibly recovery for me. That was what happened there. I saw that rehab afterwards. I could go on and on about the stories of things that happened there and came out of there and things that happened to people that I know who went in there afterwards, that I was not going to make it through that place. I made it through this place where there was a lot of political conversation. So drugs aside, I stood up for people. I'll keep it short, but at night we were given an opportunity to say how we felt during the day. And then one night I said I felt awful because of racism and sexism and homophobia. I had a whole different way of saying it. And I was kind of really scared, but I just said, I can't do this anymore here. Like people can't behave this way. It's disgusting. I kind of went off. And someone else, my roommate, who was a black guy from Brooklyn, like stood up and like joined me and just was like, yeah, that's some BS, and kind of said his own whole thing that felt like, we were just like doing this thing together and we stood up for each other and we both kind of had a moment, like felt really good. And it felt like I didn't need to be high to do it somehow. And I wouldn't have done it if I was high because I got high to hide. I got drunk to hide. And that's not what I was doing there. It felt really different.
You probably had a similar experience that a lot of young people do when they go to college, but yours is at rehab, just in terms of being exposed to diversity. I mean, we grew up in an area that was just in a community that was not diverse in almost any way. Yeah. Ethnically, religiously, ideologically, I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right.
And so when you went to rehab, you're around queer people, black people, older people. And so you see all of those dynamics at play like I did at college. Yeah. And you gravitated towards, like I did at college, the people who were historically discriminated against or who were bullied or who were, and you were what? Curious about them? You wanted
no, it felt safe because they weren't making those awful jokes about the other groups for the most part. I'm not saying that you couldn't mix and match bigotry, right? But like everybody had their shit, and I was not perfect at that moment at all, by any means. I hadn't had any kind of, progressive education or exposure or anything, but I felt like these are the people that aren't trying to get on top of everybody else. And, high school had been a pile on, and it just was this feeling that like I had been through the whole gamut in high school. I had been bullied severely and I had bullied others to get out of that. And it just was not a cycle that I wanted to be in. And I felt the temptation. I saw the opening and I didn't want to walk through that and say, oh, that's how you get the respect of people like you, is to separate how great you all are, I guess, from these other people. But, to our parents' credit and whatever, they didn't really do that either. I didn't have a model for that where like, that's how you go through life, except that I saw how poorly it worked in high school and I didn't like how it looked in rehab. I mean, that was a ridiculous setting for anyone to feel better than anybody else. So that was so humbling to walk through those doors. I was like, you all want to draw more lines? We are losers. Let's get one thing straight. Like we do not get to point fingers. I found it outrageous that people were like feeling better than someone else there. I was like, we have not done well, folks. Me worst of all. I'm only 18 and I'm already here.
Something about that's really interesting. Something about being super judgmental and filled with kind of I don't know if you want to say filled with hate, but at rehab, being judgmental at rehab. It seems like once you're at rehab, everything is kind of equal. You've all gone through probably a very difficult experience to get there, to land there. Maybe you were forced there, maybe you went by choice, but either way, it seems weird to look down on anybody at drug rehab.
Yeah. There's a woman at rehab whose face was just burned off. Half of her face was just a complete mess of scar from having her hair lit on fire while she was drunk, lighting a cigarette in the stove, which I'd done like 50 times, right? I did not feel better or smarter than anybody there.
But some people clearly did. And you thought that was weird.
Barely, honestly. Like, I got to tell you, it's not a really great stance for anybody. Like, I don't, they did say this stuff, but I think it was because they were so
beaten, they wanted to feel better than somebody.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, it was. And I guess maybe I will cop to the temptation of wanting that. I didn't want it in any of those ways, but boy, would I've loved to have someone to look down on at that point to say, well, at least I'm not that. And, it wasn't going to happen with the poor woman who lit her face on fire. I just really saw myself in her and was like, dear God, if I'm that close to having been that, then I just don't get to do that. I have to climb up from way down low.
So at what point was there an introduction to, I guess, politics?
So after rehab, I kind of go nowhere back in Syracuse for 1 week, and Mom and Dad kick me out again. They send me back to a halfway house down in Pennsylvania. And while I'm there, I reconnect with one of the counselors from that rehab who was there that night that I kind of had this transformation. And he was this great guy named Frank. I don't know if you ever met him, but Mom and Dad did. And he kind of took me under his wing and we talked politics. I don't think he was that interested in it, but he knew I was, and he encouraged it, and he bought me a couple books and as a, payment for like doing some yard work for him and stuff. He didn't give me anything for free, but he was a real good dude. And he paid attention to me and he listened to me. And that was unusual for me at that point, and I liked it. I thought maybe I have things to say or things to think about. Pretty soon after I moved back to Syracuse, 1992 still we're talking about, I started writing letters to the editor of the Syracuse newspaper.
That's right.
And I got a bunch of them published.
Yeah. A bunch of them?
Yeah, quite a few, 7 or 8 at least.
I remember one. It was about your experience with addiction, right?
Yeah, a couple of them were about drug stuff, and one of them, I said, I'm a drug user, and here's how I see drug policy, working in favor of, good drug policy for addiction related stuff. I don't know. I don't remember it, but it was a short one that they liked.
At what point did you get more specifically into politics in terms of, I feel like I want to say the main thing for you at the beginning was kind of America's foreign policy, going down that route, like Chomsky or?
Yeah. So, the momentous event for me was definitely Iran-Contra. Watching that happen.
Which is really weird. Sorry to interrupt, but you
was
were
pretty
so young.
Yeah, but I was pretty obsessed with it. You probably remember that.
I remember posters, you having the Tower Commission report, the book like that. No one had a copy of that, but old white-haired, Washington intellectuals. Like you had a copy.
I had some stuff. But that was later. When I actually studied it. I went back to college for another semester and did pretty well, getting some credits at Empire State College, an independent school, where I wrote about political science stuff, and I did a huge paper on Iran-Contra stuff.
So Iran-Contra was the first episode of history that you really got curious and interested in?
Was so obviously such an enormous crime that no one was being held accountable for. To me, that was it. Like, I didn't need to see much else about America. If you couldn't hold these guys accountable for this, and I'll tell you, Dad was irate about it, and he hyped it up for me. I don't think he knew what I know now, and it's way worse than I thought at the time. But I knew enough about what those people had been up to, and the fact that they didn't get in trouble for it just told me everything I needed to know about this country, and I've never gone astray considering it a criminal enterprise since.
But let me go back. Didn't you in like 7th, 8th, 9th grade like read and study the Vietnam War?
Yeah.
So
I read 65 books about Vietnam in my mid-teen years for some reason.
So why was that not the first? Did we forget
That's really interesting.
And where
it's because I read a lot of stuff that made me horrified by the war, but not so much that made me understand that it was a moral crime. Because I read almost everything was, American histories, or
the point of view was
soldiers. A lot of them were memoirs, right? And I got plenty of critique there. I just didn't quite see the level of the depravity of the crime. I don't think they did either, to be fair. These writers didn't see it that way, even though they were pretty forthright about the crimes that happened there. To me, I'm horrified by what America did in Vietnam. I was at the time, and I have been ever since, as I've learned more and more and more about it. I still learn things. If you watch Ken Burns' documentary, you'll learn things that I did not learn from reading those 65 books, even though I was a pretty serious expert. I could tell you what units were deployed where and what years at the time.
Yeah, it was fascinating.
But the stuff that I learned from that series just blew my mind. I hadn't paid close attention to what we were learning since or anything, and he has.
I could talk to you for a long time about the history of American foreign policy, your thoughts on it, and you could speak articulately and intellectually with all kinds of different historical examples, and it would be fascinating. But I want to delve into a few other things with you, and we can come back maybe if we have time, if you want, and we can do this forever because what the hell else do we get to do? But
fair enough.
Economics. Like, at what point did you become interested in economics? Because I think that your thoughts on economic philosophy are as interesting and as original or even as radical and maybe even far-fetched. Yep. I could probably,
sure.
If I could critique you anywhere, it would be on that, because I feel like there's a lot of flaws in what you believe based on just human behavior and psychology and why these kind of ideas can't work. But I know you have answers for it. But why did you become interested at all in economics, and what else would we call it? Like
political economy, economics, like envisioning an alternative society. Like, is that mostly what you're talking about?
Yeah,
that's how I approach economics, mostly. Right.
But also just the idea of wealth inequality. I mean, you understood our class system pretty well I think at a young age, but which is not that original. I guess a lot of people recognize that. Certainly poor people do, but we weren't poor.
Right.
So it doesn't stand to reason that you would understand that.
Not only weren't we poor, but when I was 9 years old and you were 7, our father moved us from a very poor relatively poor neighborhood.
Up until 9 and 7,
to the suburbs. I actually thought that was just what happened. I kind of was waiting for our friends to do the same thing, right? Like I thought that was the American dream, and therefore that,
right?
Yeah, we had kind of I won't call it a full false positive. That wasn't a completely uncommon event at the time.
We moved from a very poor neyborhood in city of Syracuse to a rural suburban dead end street surrounded by cornfields and at the beginning of a housing development, really.
In a house that our father had built custom. So I sort of thought that's what happens.
He had somebody build it by saying it made it sound like Dad was out there.
He didn't
with
swing a hammer.
Okay, so how did you get interested in the political economy?
Boy, I don't know. I think for high school, I read some Marx at first, and it was intriguing, and I read more Marx later. And to this day, I think that Marx is one of the key thinkers. Karl Marx, absolutely. One of the key thinkers of history.
When people hear you say that, what do you think what is the reaction?
I don't know. It's interesting, right? I mean, if you don't trust that someone has smart things to say, and they say, if you talk to economists who've studied Marx, which isn't most economists,
really? It's not like
it's absolutely not. It's not taught. I mean, Marx is not discussed in any of the economics departments in America.
Marxism, primary economic philosophy?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it's a materialist philosophy, meaning that it's kind of econocentric, which is a critique I have of it, that it's maybe too econocentric. But I had a critique of Marx fairly early. I fell in with some anarchists when I was like 20 and was doing activism, and that's who was doing the kind of activism, anti-war activism in Syracuse at the time, and that's who I met. I was really lucky. I had kind of pretended to be an anarchist in high school because I thought it was cool, but I didn't know anyone really was, and then I met these adults who took it seriously. I read Chomsky very early. I was looking for media, and I wandered into the Syracuse Peace Council and asked, they had a library and a bookstore up front. And
Syracuse Peace Council radicalized you.
Yeah.
I think it did.
Yeah,
because of what they had available.
But I was asking for it, and they had the goods to fulfill my needs.
It's interesting because if you walk into your school library or you walk into a public library,
the first Marx stuff was at the Marcellus High School Library. I'll tell you that. Yeah.
Well, it was available, and that's not uncommon, I suppose.
Right, it was available. No one was pointing me at it. Yeah, obviously, I was trying to piss off some teacher probably by doing a report on it in the first place. I don't know.
But you were drawn to obviously.
Why aren't we supposed to talk about Marx? Why is everybody so fanatical about that guy? That kind of stuff, I thought about that at the time, yeah. I definitely wanted to hear from people that...
And how do you explain that philosophy and how does it influence you today?
Well, I mean, the thing that people don't understand is that the things that we see that are called Marxism are not his ideas by any stretch. They're just other people's implementation of what they think you're supposed to do if you have his critique of capitalism. His critique of capitalism is amazing. It's thorough. It's right on. It's been proven out. It's really it's predictive. It talks about capitalism in a way. He has an essay that clearly predicts computers. The guy is an incredible mind. He was talking about things in ways that have since really panned out. I mean, it's hard to get into details, but that's what turned me on originally. And I had a critique of it, and I met people early on who did. Anarchists have a kind of built-in critique of modern Marxism, and a lot of it is just a critique of Marx's early ideas. So I didn't become an authoritarian like a lot of people do with those ideas. I thought, what you don't want to do is decide that if everyone needs to be equal, that you're going to dictate that from the top and decide what that means and what everybody gets to do. That clearly doesn't work. But no one that I met at the time thought it did. I didn't encounter anybody that thought the Soviet Union had been a good idea. Some people were sympathetic to some of the things Cuba was doing, but they were all critical. We had these great critical conversations about how you could, lead toward an equitable society without doing it in an authoritarian way.
Most people can't separate the two. We don't have an education enough to separate the two. And most people, they look at any country that has tenets of communism or socialism or capitalism, and they're misled by the political ideology or the authoritarian,
right,
or the corruption, really, that so often comes with any government. And so when you think about today's current arguments against socialism, you hear people on the right say, Venezuela, is that what you want to look like? Or Soviet Russia, is that what you want to look like? And what's the problem with that?
Yeah, I mean, I've always maintained that most radical socialists or communists of the modern era, of which I don't care what labels, but somewhere in there is me. We have a full critique of that. A lot of them got sympathetic to Venezuela for a while under Chavez, but I never did. I mean, I was sympathetic with the people, and I thought some of the programs were good ideas, but I knew that an authoritarian figure who didn't have a backup plan, a succession plan, was a complete disaster. I said it at the time. A lot of people that on the left were favorable for that, but most of us, I think, had a pretty good understanding that this is never going to be the way to impose socialism. It has to be a popular movement. It has to come, and it probably needs to be implemented by people that were more empowered and better educated than that first round of Venezuelans who could. I mean, they did quite amazing projects there, and they really made great gains. They screwed up their economy in the process, of course, but you can see programs that are socialist programs that work, and then you can easily see better ways. I knew people that were already thinking about better ways to implement that same style of community socialism in the developing world where community projects are needed to bring people up in the first place to get education and literacy out there so that they can be, participating as in a democratic system. But they did quite well there. They really did improve people's situations such that they were empowered and somewhat autonomously organizing their own communities. So that stuff was attractive to me. And I can look at a project and see what works and doesn't and say, look, I'm not a Chavista, and I never was, but I can clearly see that some of these things were successful and could be tried elsewhere and funded better and this and that,
We can talk about foreign policy. We can talk about politics. We can talk about economics and economic philosophy. But the thing that you really are most interested in talking about is revolution. And that's really where we get into your book. And so you've studied the history of revolution.
Somewhat, yeah, not as an academic, so I don't really consider myself a full-on expert, but I've also tried to put it in practice in different ways, over the last 25 years in ways that most academics probably haven't bothered, so.
You would consider yourself a revolutionary.
Yeah. I believe that means that you try to model the society that you would try to achieve first, and I don't think you make a move at trying to overthrow anything or tear down any institutions until you prove that you can do better, but I'm fully on board for that part of the game, and I've tried it a few times, and I'm always looking for a good project, where we can prove some facet of socialism that works, or, collective workplaces and things like that.
Right. There's all kinds of different ways to talk about changing society and changing systems, which is always what you're most interested in talking about and thinking about and actually doing. And you've actually done it yourself, including with the New Standard. Tell everybody what that was real quick.
Yeah, so in 2003, with a few people, I organized a news website that was kind of a progressive, hard news reporting. So we had reporters all over the world. We ran for about 3.5 years, and we published about 3,000 articles, and it was a really great project. We paid everybody for all that work. We funded it through donations. We had a lot of great successes, but it was a burnout factory, and we didn't really have the runway that we needed to bring on more workers and that kind of stuff. But it was I've always considered that a pretty successful project, even though it only lasted 3.5 years. Everyone, when we started, told us we wouldn't last 6 months. So that was pretty cool.
Hardest thing was raising money.
The hardest thing was raising money because we were on the internet at a time where, while we had a plan to kind of maybe wall off some content someday, we were not doing that. We were just asking for donations, and we did get quite a lot, actually. We'd had pretty successful fundraisers, and we had people giving us, like people do on Patreon now, and we were making a good clip. We were making per donor more than anybody else that we knew of on the internet. We were making like $14.50 a month per person that was donating, if you excluded people who gave $1,000 a year or more. That was unheard of at the time. So yeah, we had a lot of successes, but more important, that was because we're thinking about the economics of it. So then we funded a collective that was a flat organization where we had these things we called balanced job complexes, where everyone had kind of a fair arrangement of work, whether you were a reporter or an editor. You did some accounting, you did some organizing of our events that we had to do. There was a logistical stuff
of responsibilities.
Yeah. And we based all that on pretty sound theories of how you would organize a collective workplace with jobs that are balanced for empowerment, meaning everyone there is supposed to be built up. So we had a lot of people of color and women working and writing with us over those years. And I was super proud of that. It was great. I mean, part of that was because we were paying on the low end, and those, marginalized groups are filled with people who don't have high expectations, but want to be treated like, hey, I'm going to put in a hard day's work. Give me what you can for it. Right. So that was such a better environment to work in than these corporate places that have so much money that you stare at them and go, why can't I have more of that? So if I've ever written for someone or worked for someone, or, even seeing you at SiriusXM, there's a lot of opulence here that could go into my brother's paycheck. What I would think. That's all I see in these places. And I never wanted to be part of that. So we formed a nonprofit collective. We just did it ourselves, All
right, let's get back to Revolution then. So you were in Seattle for the World Trade.
I wasn't.
You weren't?
I watched Seattle from home after telling all of my radical friends that I thought it was going to be another lame protest like the last 5 I had been to.
Oh, I thought you were there.
It was a bad call. I wasn't there. I was at everything after that. And, I made a point to go to every major thing in the Northeast after that. What happened in the WTO protest? What was that? People came out to, it was a leftist protest against neoliberalism. That used to be who was against neoliberalism. Now, apparently, Trumpsters get to try to take up that mantle as well if they want. But we were, trying to posit an alternative way of looking at globalism. We weren't anti-globalization. We were just like, look, we have a globe. We need to fess up to that and deal with it. But you don't deal with it by trying to get one over on all the weaker countries. And that was what the World Trade Organization was all about. It was designed by Western, northern corporations and countries to exploit the developing world. It was going to bring a lot of capital into the developing world, but it was going to bring a whole lot of wealth out. And we thought that was an exploitative, and they were going to do it in a destructive manner. And people turned out to oppose their gathering in Seattle on November 30th, 1999. And I watched from home. Actually, what I did was build a platform. I built a software platform at the time so that people could post news from the streets in real time, photos, audio, video, and texts. And that was one of a couple projects that happened at that time. It was the smaller of the two. The other one was Indie Media, but I single-handedly coded that platform, and hundreds of people used it during the protest to report what was happening on the streets, which was police going crazy on protesters and using lots of violence and tear gas and rubber bullets and stuff.
So you weren't at that one, but you were at subsequent.
Yeah, so somehow I watched that and decided I wanted to be a street medic after that. And I had been to many protests, but after that I went to protests as a trained and sort of equipped and organized street medic to offer assistance to protesters who were injured, or passersby who were injured by police, or, got sick from heat stroke or something during a march, or anything that anyone needed for first aid.
So what kind of, all types of different protests for different causes?
Well, they were leftist protests.
Right.
Most of them were around that anti-capitalist globalization stuff. That was pretty big. I think people forget what happened there. But before 9/11, the country was definitely tilting drastically against a lot of the trade organizations and a lot of government activity. We had a moment there where these protests were getting bigger. They were spreading. The most intense one was coming in late September 2001 to Washington, D.C. And that one, we were going to tear that city apart over how everyone in it was intentional, Democrat and Republican alike, intending on treating the developing world. And I thought that was very just, and I was going to treat anybody that got injured in the process. But instead, 9/11 happened, and I had a very different path after that.
Which you did actually respond to as a medic.
Yeah, I came down on the night of the 11th.
Syracuse at the time.
Yeah, there was kind of a general call out, and I had just gotten my EMT certificate, like literally just gotten it. It was still a paper form. They hadn't even sent me the card. And I and another EMT in that same exact situation who got the same certificate on the same day drove down there. And honestly, because of her, we got eventually straight into the center of Manhattan, and we worked on the 12th at the St. Vincent's Trauma Center.
But there wasn't much to do because there were so little injuries.
There wasn't much to do, but we treated several firefighters and police who came in who were injured in the recovery effort. I don't think I saw anybody, from the original incident.
But even then, what you saw was mostly like
crush injuries and stuff like
Oh,
that.
you did
But
see
survivors, yeah. People
you did?
survived it. I mean, you saw crush injuries at the worst, and you saw like abrased corneas and injured hands. And we saw a lot of firefighters were getting hurt. And what they would do was, we would see them 4 at a time because 3 lightly injured firefighters who were told by their captains, "You're finished," would not get in an ambulance until someone who had literally like a destroyed leg would come along. And then you'd see like 3 injured firefighters would climb in that ambulance with them, and then they'd all pour out on top of us. And I worked in the decontamination station. So the 2 of us, that other EMT whose name was Bounce, the 2 of us went in and got into the station, and that's where we worked all day.
Did you have an EMT name?
I didn't have an EMT name. I tried to make Dr. Pepper stick because I was pretty good at treating pepper spray, but I was on the cover of some Boston Phoenix or something, I think, in my picture, and it said Dr. Pepper or something, so they kind of gave me that one.
Did 9/11 change it changed the trajectory of pretty much everything in the world? I mean, no matter what your industry was, and in America, rather, certainly in New York, but really in America. So did that then change the commitment or the interest in protest of trade? And did that event ever take place?
So that event, the protests still took place, but they were an anti-Afghanistan invasion protest at that time. So I was on board again.
They adapted.
I was fully on board because I was pretty sure Afghanistan was going to go kind of the way it's gone. In fact, I'm embarrassingly right before we invaded thought this is such a bad idea that they can't possibly fall for it. They'll do some special forces thing.
Right.
We'll all miss it like we kind of did the last couple things that our country has done. It wasn't, we weren't at full scale war through most of my adult life, my activist life, although I was opposing every little skirmish and invasion intervention that we got in. Yeah. But, nothing even like Afghanistan, where it was so obviously a disaster and entrenchment where the Soviets had gone down. I mean, none of this was any surprise to the left. I don't know where people were thinking we were going. At what point,
when did you go to the West Bank and why?
So I decided in that period in the early 2000s that protests were going to continue to get more and more militant in the United States. That was just my projection. So I assumed that we would eventually get to situations where there might be live fire, where there might be concussion grenades, the types of stuff that is used in the West Bank. So that's one reason that I decided to go there and work as an EMT. I really wanted those skills, and I wanted to be able to come back. And I was already teaching first aid. I was teaching street medic, tactics and techniques in first aid at that time. And I thought, it's a great way to add to my skill set. So that was why I went to Palestine for the most part. And I was in solidarity with the Palestinian people. I mean, I'm just not trying to take a lot of credit for that. I wanted to learn from their movement while helping them very directly. I wanted to get that experience and bring it home and say, here's how we deal when things escalate. Here's how you treat a rifle wound, for instance.
So,
which is not a common thing for a street medic to treat here.
What changed for you, and what do you think changed, at least for America, in terms of anything? What changed for you? What changed for America post 9/11?
I mean, 9/12 for me, that day that I spent down there, and then we ended up right down at what was called the site at the time, but was then called Ground Zero for every day after that. We ended up down there. We went down to Stuyvesant High, and we kind of hung out in this place that I wrote about later and just thought was just the most morbid situation I've ever been in, where there were just hundreds of photos of people, all of that stuff. As soon as you were helpless, when I was in there and waiting, but I was going to be the first one to grab some firefighter and like help out, that was okay. But once we were down at Stuyvesant High, which was the headquarters for the recovery effort, those first couple days, if not longer probably, but I didn't stay. I had had enough, like just seeing that and then feeling helpless, like that changed me personally in a way where I was just in touch with the horror at that point. Seeing the firefighters, these tough guys or whatever, that had given me a different thing. I don't know if you might have noticed, because I think you went down somewhere on that day.
We were closer to the site. We were at the site on 9/11.
Okay.
Because Val,
right.
My wife,
right, I forget this.
Was a rubbernecker. I mean, she wanted to walk all the way down there, and I was like, "What are you doing? Stop! There's nothing. We can't help. We're going to be in the way. What am I going to tell jokes?
Heckle people?" On 9/12, there was this thing where you could see that the firefighters were refusing to wear masks, even if they were just working the recovery effort. I think that they did eventually. This is not to indicate that they brought on any of the illnesses that they got, but they were in pure solidarity with those guys that were buried. I mean, there was just this feeling that you got in if you saw guys doing that, and you just really saw what happened down there. Oh man, I had a while before I was okay after that, for sure.
Huh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, it was really rough.
Affected. So,
but partly because I work on an EMT or a street medic works on this with gallows humor, but I actually got fed up. You couldn't do gallows humor that day. Like you couldn't do that kind of stuff. It was just this colossal thing. You can't. It's not someone with a broken leg or even someone shot. Like
it was mass
nothing
death.
There was nothing to deal with it like the way we knew. Yeah. When the scale of it hit me, I think down at Stuyvesant High and a few other little elements, that I could talk about another time, but just, it really did rip me up. And I came home and I wrote an essay I wrote an op-ed to the Syracuse paper. That's who I wanted to talk to. And I said, hey, it might have probably published it on the web too, but I said, this is a really good argument against war. We need to heed this.
What's a really good argument against war?
We had just done this in Serbia. We had taken out a building that had broadcast media in it.
Take a sip. Take it all.
We had committed a war crime blowing up this civilian media building in Serbia that killed tons of people in 1999. And then 2 years later, this thing happened to us. And it's take this lesson. Don't do this to people. This is not the solution to things. We should look at what war looks like for the first real time in our country. Mass scale death on our territory. Yeah. How do you draw any lesson from this other than we need to slow down and be careful as we go ahead? And of course, 9 people took that lesson. Yeah, but don't you?
I agree. I agreed with you then as I agree with you now, and not based on my knowledge of the world, but based on getting punched. I was someone who, if I got punched, I would ask, why did you punch me? And how do I prevent you from punching me again, as opposed to punching them back?
Yeah.
So it wasn't
So it's common sense, in other words. It could be. Well, it should be. You broke it down to an analogy. I don't know how to describe it,
because other people would describe it as kind of a pride. If you punch me, I'm not going to let you push me around.
Yeah, I'm going to punch you.
But the vast majority of Americans, it was the only time in our lifetime, probably ever, till our deaths, that we were ever that unified. And the unity came in a lot of different ways, but it certainly did come from a lot of people that we would get revenge on whoever did this to us.
Yeah.
And
that's where I left off. I was like, hey, I'm in solidarity. I drove right in there and I breathed in those bags. I was the guy that stocked all the uniforms that were covered in that dust, and I was right in there. I believed in all that solidarity. Yeah.
It was my home.
Right.
I knew people who died.
But that's where it ended for me. Going to war
Exactly. I didn't want any more people to die anyway.
All right, well,
as a result. And
I think history bore us out. And
you didn't
it's
have to
hard
know
to
much,
see this another way, I think.
And that generation of the architects of those wars knew what happened with the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. And they'd experienced something, we lost to insurgents in Vietnam. It's like it was
but we knew what the neocons were up to too, right? So,
right away.
I didn't come out for any of the conspiracy theories, but I did also see that a prime beneficiary of this is George W. Bush and his administration. I mean, that was
and the whole
clear.
Project for a New American Century, which for a long time wanted to invade Iraq, and this was their excuse.
Yeah. So and now it was a stomach turning thing. And so in September of 2011, when I'm no longer in New York City, but I'm down in D.C., I don't remember what the exact dates were, but I think in the early 20s, so just a couple weeks later, and we had canceled what we were going to do. They had canceled their conference. We didn't have anything to oppose. I think that was the IMF and World Bank, and they weren't coming to town because of 9/11. So we were not going to go and tear up town over their meeting. So we went and kind of tore up town over this war. And, we were on the side of don't send American troops into harm's way. And the police were beating the crap out of everybody because they were on the side of send American troops into harm's way. And we fought it out in the streets with them for a whole day or two. Might also
be just because
they hate us.
So, but let's go off on a quick tangent, because the architects of the Iraq War, the Project for a New American Century, your Wolfowitz, your Pearl, your Cheney, and your Bill Kristol, and a whole bunch of others, of course. But those are four of the top names. I think the Bushes were I think even not in the front of that.
No,
I think
they weren't.
Took convincing. So certainly Colin Powell took convincing, and almost anybody who served in a war took convincing. Yeah. But years later, after 9/11, at a restaurant in Aspen, Val and I sat down right next to Bill Kristol, and we were right. I don't know if I ever told you this. We were at a table right next to him, and I assume his wife. And I said to Val, we have to go. And she's like, had no idea what I was talking about. And I knew she wouldn't know what I was talking about. So I just walked out.
You just couldn't deal with.
Well, I walked out and hoped she'd follow me. She's like, what's going on? And I said, we can't sit next to that guy. And I told her who Bill Kristol was, and she didn't care about that really. But I knew I couldn't enjoy dinner with my wife by sitting next to that guy. But the reason I bring that up to you now is you have said that Trump still isn't as bad as Bush because he doesn't have the blood in his hands of the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. And Bill Kristol now is kind of a never Trumper. He's on TV all the time. He's got a lot of credibility because he's a hardcore conservative Republican who's against Donald Trump.
Yeah.
But I wanted to my question is, did I frame your view of kind of the Bush administration and their crimes versus
both the Bush administrations and the Reagan administration, and the way I grew up and seeing these crimes done practically in the open. I mean, several of them were quite in the open. Our invasion of Panama was straight illegal. These things were illegal actions that our presidents were taking, and no one was holding them accountable. Yes, I absolutely knew that. Yeah.
What was?
You can't do that. You do not get to invade another country. It's super simple. You don't get to do it. All of these things have been illegal. It's kind of amazing how little Americans appreciate about. We've been, the UN has found that we were guilty on several of these cases. Like, this isn't fringe stuff.
Why do you care what the UN? You give credit to what the UN decides?
No, I mean, they don't do this very often. The U.S. usually blocks it, but on some of the occasions they've gotten it through because it's been that bad, and the whole world has been like, "Oh my God, you guys, you can't do it that flagrantly." The Nicaragua stuff. All ends of it were illegal, not just Iran-Contra. That was illegal from the U.S. standpoint. I mean, do you appreciate what happened? The United States Congress made us explicit law in 1984 that you cannot arm these specific people because they are straight terrorists. The Contras in Nicaragua were straight mass murdering people right in the open. This was not controversial. This is what was happening. And the U.S. said, maybe we can't be so explicitly doing that. And the United States Congress passed a law that they can't do it, and they did it anyway. But they did it by selling arms to the other side of a war that we are already supporting Iraq in, which was Iran. So they armed both sides in a war that killed 1 million people, a horrendous...
The Iraq-Iran War.
Yeah, the Iraq-Iran War is a story in and of itself. It's just a complete horror show, and we literally backed both sides. That is beyond the pale. And no one... That wasn't even a point that anybody made at the time, by the way. I find that morally depraved that no one noted. Because we weren't really paying attention to the fact that we were arming Iraq while Saddam Hussein was killing Kurds under our watch. This has been going on forever. So what I see now is a lot of people clutching their pearls over the way Donald Trump behaves, but I don't see his crimes as being worse than the ones that we've let happen in broad daylight and not held anyone accountable for.
You see Trump is so easy to hate because he's such a despicable character in terms of his behavior. Right. But you're not nearly as offended by his behavior.
I super am. Don't get me wrong. I find him abhorrent. I mean, I'm really as aghast as anybody else, but I think that's what people hate. Most people hate about him. If you want to be morally consistent, we need to have a conversation about this country that everybody thinks just went off the rails. I mean, where are people's memories? Right. The Iraq War was a crime on a scale that we should never, ever forget, and we've straight forgotten it. The way people are laughing and palling around with George Bush, I find it disturbing that we've let go of that and been like, well, at least, I miss George Bush, all of that kind of stuff. No. We didn't hold anybody accountable for that because we didn't care enough, and we're not enough of a country to admit it. And that's what I see in this place. That's why I have no love for this nation. None whatsoever. We don't hold ourselves accountable. We are not a grown-up nation, as far as I can see. And that's just not worth respect. We don't hold ourselves accountable for our blatant crimes, some of which are worse than anything else done in this century. This is amazing, the things that we've let slide.
Yeah, when you think just a little bit about the invasion of Iraq, on just the idea that we went into that country, the way that the war was carried out, and the torture and Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, it's almost less about the combat and the war crimes that might have been committed during combat, because that's every
that's a whole other thing that I reported on very closely and got a very good eye on, but because we had a journalist in Iraq running around getting real news there. But
that's most wars and both sides of most wars. You don't have, or at least you weren't supposed to have, Americans torturing people after, there was I recently heard this phrase, the death of decency. Trump has killed any sense of decency, but torture was really in many ways the death of decency, because we'd seen all the other behaviors of war, but we weren't supposed to be doing that. But we were so afraid, and I think Cheney and the rest thought it would work. Except for the people who...
I mean, to me, that was just you're right. I think it was maybe the bottom, but I didn't need all that to know that we were guilty of these tremendous crimes going in. Look, you got to remember, I wasn't worried I didn't think in any way, shape, or form that Saddam Hussein had any weapons. And I had reasons for that.
I didn't either, though.
Because we had fully ensured that he didn't.
Well, the people
that worked really well. Yeah.
The weapons inspectors, that was their job. And they made a strong case against it.
Yeah, I recall that you also were in no way fooled by that. But that was kind of it's not how it's talked about now.
It's not how it's talked about now, but I think most people even weren't fooled. I forget what the polling was.
I think most people weren't fooled, but I do think that I was certain that they weren't, because I believed in those inspection processes that happened before, which was a weird position to be in. But I actually looked at what they did and saw how thorough it was. You could see it. The media was not doing this. I mean, the New York Times was not doing this. That was another level of depravity. People think that these news organizations are good, but I've also never believed that. I've never fallen for it. And now that it's all kind of coming undone and everybody can kind of see what a mess it's all been, I think that there's models for how to do it better. I think I did it better with an organization that decided to do the news in a radically different way. We didn't have any resources. I think it can be done better than it's done by these giant corporations.
Well, you've always wanted to blow up the system, the economic system, the education system, the healthcare system, as you just mentioned. journalism and media. You've always had a strong opinion on how all of these things could be and should be done differently. And now your book.
Well, we don't have a democracy in this country, and that's part of why, right? Sorry, I don't want to interrupt you talking about my book, but to me, the evidence that we don't have a democracy is that we need these like few hundred people in Washington to do all this work for us because we aren't educated enough to do this for ourselves. We can't participate in democracy except to hire these people that I've never pulled the lever for someone I could stand. Right? So even if they won, which they never did, I wasn't going to feel represented by them. They didn't agree with me on almost any issue, but they were just not as bad as the other guy. So, okay, I get it. Like I would vote for a Democrat once in a while throughout my life. I didn't vote in every election.
But that's because you don't think, you just said something about you don't think you don't think we're educated.
Yeah, I don't think we are ready to do democracy on a mass scale, but I believe that's because of our completely failed education system. I think Americans could totally do this and do it much better than corporate-sponsored elites, which is what they are.
You believe in democracy.
I believe in real democracy, not representative or Republican democracy. I believe in real democracy.
What's real democracy? And is that
this isn't super controversial. The original definition of democracy is the direct rule by people. So you're modifying democracy anytime you've got an intervener, which an intervener is a politician, a delegate, anybody like that. So most people in my position that believe in direct democracy like a form that's fluid where you could delegate your vote on certain issues, or you could always keep it to yourself, and you can opt to vote on every piece of legislation. This wasn't technically possible before, but it's not educationally possible right now because people don't know how to read laws. It's an elite process. It's always been the case that most politicians are lawyers or have lawyers and people that do legal writing on staff. That's the kind of language that law is done in. But I think there's probably a happy medium in there where we could be making and voting on our own legislation.
And you think that now more than ever because of the technology that is available now. You have the internet and you have phones, and you think that creates an opportunity for a completely different, a more robust democracy, or as you refer to it, a direct democracy?
Yeah, that's right, because you'd be able to use technology to access the information that you need, the same information. It wouldn't work on everything in our society right now. I'm not saying that we would vote on, commando strikes or something, but, through legislative stuff, policy stuff, we could have a much, much more of a say. Even registering opinions by having people actively engaged would be a step in that direction. But we don't do anything like that. We let corporations do polling to see what we think about things in their own words. But there's no self-organized democracy. There's nothing that represents. There's nothing I recognize as democracy in the American political system.
Is there anywhere in the world?
Above maybe the local scale. Yeah, in the place that we're abandoning, Rojava right now, where the Kurds have formed a very robust direct delegate-based democracy with nested councils and all sorts of really interesting forms of democracy that they designed for themselves around their own culture from anarchist influences in part, and now is all under attack from the Turkish government. But there's all kinds of models that have been in existence. But no, I think it's something that we would need to aim for as a society. But it's not the way we're headed.
So you've written Present as Prologue, a Gen Zero novella, and it, in a way, is the beginning of the blueprint of breaking down the broken systems that we have and rebuilding them the way that you think, as we've been talking about to some extent in a lot of different fields, would be more effective, would be more representative, would be more equitable. And you choose guns and gun violence as the issue to start with. And yet you actually don't think gun violence ranks anywhere near many of the other issues that we've talked about in terms of racism and sexism and democracy and trade issues and education issues. Like, explain.
Well, I don't think that mass shootings, which are the actual topic, the mass shootings are a horrendous problem that I really strongly want to address, and just spent a long time studying and like thinking about how to solve.
Are they a horrendous problem, or are they a very dramatic and impactful?
Right. I mean, I'm using the word horrendous in the sense of like, this type of violence. Every time it happens, we all go through this thing where we recognize the terror of it. It is a special thing.
The idea of innocent people being gunned down while they're going about their day is something very unique and very terrorizing and horrifying. And yet, even as it has happened more and more, it is not something. It is a very small percentage of gun violence, and in gun violence, there's a lot more of an issue really with suicide. There's more of an issue, obviously, with gang violence, and other types of gun violence, as opposed to
domestic violence, police violence. I think more people are shot by police every year than are killed in mass shootings. So this is, it's a horrible thing that we especially don't want our kids to have to go through. And now they're being traumatized by the drills and all this stuff that you know very well. False alarms that can terrorize a kid just straight up. It almost doesn't matter if the shooter's there. They think the shooter's there.
We do them here in the house. Lockdowns.
Well, yeah, sure. You mean you got to keep in practice.
Let's go, girls.
It's really freaky, and we didn't. We skipped. Our generation kind of skipped that level of kind of existential terror.
Not me. I was terrorized by the idea of nuclear war.
Right.
For
I know you were.
Few years.
Yeah, you were, and a lot of people were. They were. I know this since. I've known, I have been in the anti-nuke movement in and out. I've had close friends who are pretty heavily involved. There's a common theme there. A lot of young people had that. I had some of it, but you had a real horror that kind of got it under your skin in a way.
It's kind of ridiculous, but.
Well,
I was also worried about tornadoes.
Who knows what messages?
But the
got
point
to
is,
you
you're saying that young people are particularly affected, obviously, by this, and we can understand why. It's all over the news. It's happening in their schools. It did not happen in schools growing up. And Columbine was the first, really.
Right. Columbine was the first. And the day that Columbine happened, I was speaking on a panel about the war in Kosovo at Syracuse University. And we all got in there, and all of us anti-war panelists were kind of sitting up there being like, this feels like appropriate for the nation that we're in. Our government has said we're going to solve these things with mass violence. And now a bunch of, I don't think that was actually the influence. But to me, this is like, we live in this violent society. And I was terrified that was the beginning of something that it has been. And I have thought about it for these last 20 years. It's been an outsized part of my concern, like I think it is for many young people. Even though I was already an adult when Columbine happened, that idea of mass terror in a place that you are made to go by the government, even though you don't want to be there.
School.
Yeah, school. I mean, I hated being in school already. And the idea that someone could march down the hall with a rifle or a pistol shooting everybody? No. No, it already is not worth being here. So I have just for the last 20 years had this sympathy of anybody that might find themselves
smoking cigarettes. Nobody even knew where you were.
We were definitely trying to get away as much as possible.
So why did you create the narrative that you did about guns? Explain as much as you want here about.
I really literally sat down after Parkland and smoked a joint and wondered how you would get rid of guns to stop this. It just for a story, like knowing full well that I don't have any power or influence and no one's even going to read an essay or anything that I'm going to write, but maybe I can come up with a narrative about it. So I, in one sort of sitting, I come up with the idea, well, I know that the most successful way to collect guns is with a gun buyback, but the rifles that I want to collect, assault rifles, the things that I treated in the West Bank, the things I want to get rid of, the things that are the favorite weapons of these mass killers.
You treated gunshot wounds from assault rifles in the West Bank.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
The 5.56 millimeter round, I treated that several times and found it quite horrifying.
It's what it does to the human body.
It's what it does to the body.
It's different than other types of rounds in terms of
several of these rounds have similar characteristics, but yeah, this one's a tumbler and a splitter, and I saw some pretty horrific wounds come out of those rifles, fired against civilians in almost every case. A couple of them probably not. I didn't always know, but.
So the gun buyback idea seemed like the most effective one, and so...
Right, I mean, that's clearly the most effective, but we've got this problem where people are not going to get rid of these guns for anything like a market value of these. You'd have to force them, which I know is not going to work in this country. So I thought, What if you made a crypto coin that, you know, a cryptocurrency that was based on mining these guns by destroying them? You mine the currency by destroying the guns, and then people invested in it who wanted to kind of buy these guns off, and you could get a momentum going of people turning them in and destroying them as the value goes up. Some of these guns are only worth a couple $100s. People couldn't sell them if they wanted to now. But if they could just march over to some place and be witnessed destroying this gun and then collect a digital coin that's worth several $100s at first, and then thousands, and then maybe 10,000. And as this price goes up, you know, people would move the gun. They would go for the guns. But there's a huge hole in this, which is that the manufacturers would just, you know, dump more guns on the market. This isn't solving anything. But if a movement, you know, deployed to all the manufacturing places and all the shipping points that kind of shut those down, that's where I get kind of imaginative of how you could block off the supply, and at the seaports as well with the Longshoremen's Union. So a lot of this is the background to the story that I tell in the novel.
And that's it's a fascinating idea, and it's a fun read that moves along. I hope everybody will buy the book and read it for sure. But what's most interesting is that this, to me, in talking to you, is that this is not the issue that you're the most interested in. It's not the issue that you think is the most important issue, and the issue I mean is gun violence. Right. It is a horrible problem in this country. But really what you're leading into with the book is a larger revolution to change the way the rest of our systems work. Exactly. To create, I'm guessing, more access to opportunity to create a more equitable society. Yeah. In terms of education, in terms of
and including
healthcare.
Internationally too, because I think we owe the world something, having exploited the hell out of it for the last couple hundred years. Absolutely.
What do you mean?
We have not paid fair prices for the resources that we have extracted from other countries.
Oh, I understand what you mean by that.
Oh, okay, sorry.
but that's but in terms of how the revolution is a worldwide, a global revolution, which you think. You basically think that young people should have a lot more responsibility, or more. You say that young people should be a protected class. Well, or they're an oppressed class.
Yeah, I mean,
this is
20 going back 25 years. I wrote an essay about that, and it's actually, I think, the most thorough treatment of the era, and since possibly people still write me about it saying, "Isn't there more stuff?" And I'm like, I don't know. I wrote some stuff back then, didn't really take. I shouldn't say that. We did a lot of work around it. Me and a few other young people. We were in something called the Youth Liberation Movement, or something loosely, and by the time I was 25, it had fizzled out, and that was about the time that we were kind of aging out, that people were not really participating in this stuff. It was just conferences and things talking about, like, well, how could young people organize differently to, fight for their own rights and, fight to be respected. And a lot of the direction that it went was young people advocating for kids that were in the worst situations, like abusive homes or being taken out and mistreated by social services, and advocating for them and that sort of stuff. It kind of always turned into something very reasonable and advocacy-wise. And the youth liberation has never been a thing in and of itself where young people are organizing as young people to liberate young people. It always immediately turns into environmentalism and animal rights and women and LGBTQ and all these things in race, and it should, right? Like, it's fine. These kids immediately think, you know what, I'm not as oppressed as a young person as all these groups are. That seems to be the way that consciousness raising actually heads. And I've mostly obviously been okay with that my whole life. I've thought maybe that's what youth is. But I think we're coming to a time where youth is something different right now. Youth, if you're young today, that means you are facing a century that is much more frightening than we even realized when we were that age. When I was a teenager, even though I knew what climate change was, I did not understand at all what we were headed toward. By the time I was in my early 20s, I did, and I got worried, and then the predictions got worse and things got worse. I learned more about economics. I got more concerned about our social infrastructure, how our society is going to function, how we're going to run out of some resources, and that's going to create really significant conflicts, and we're going to end up exploiting the world in worse and worse ways. So I've been on board for a drastically different way to approach all of this stuff my whole adult life, 25 years now. And I do think young people are the key. because I think young people are a natural class, not so much to fight for themselves as like kids who aren't allowed to drive or drink or any of that BS, but as kids who aren't allowed to have a say in their future when they are the people with the most future left to live. So democracy, to me, if we really want to get down to it, means you have input on the decisions that affect your life to the extent they affect your life, to the extent you personally or your class or your region or your group is affected. That's what democracy has to mean if it means anything useful at all. If we're at a workplace, democracy means I arrange my desk however I want, but I don't necessarily get to play music all day that I want, right? Out loud. We understand this really naturally as humans. This is how, that's the moral scale of democracy, that we need to scale that up all the way. That's how we should be treating each other as peoples, as societies, as nations. And I think that's possible. And what I really think is that if people under 25 ran society, we would do it. We would be very different. We would be a future-oriented, planned, strictly, carefully handled society that we would be rationed immediately, just like we were in World War II.
How do people under 25 know anything about anything?
Yeah, I think
why
the hard
give them
part
so
is
much responsibility if they have so little experience? Doesn't experience matter?
Well, I mean, experience definitely by saying that only people 18 and over could vote was definitely, people don't say this, right? But that's one of the reasons that Donald Trump won. If 16 and year over could vote, Donald Trump probably would have lost. So we have everyone has their favorite reason that Donald Trump didn't win, but he didn't win because we have an old electorate of people that are immature and don't take the vote seriously. And we all know that better than ever. And yet we have the audacity to look at young people, at a 16-year-old who's sophisticated and studies the issues and has so much to lose and such a dismal future that they want to get working on. And we say, no, you're not even sophisticated enough to hire the person who will rule you, which is what an election is to me. I don't need that person. I can study this stuff. I can read it. I can understand how I would vote on every piece of legislation. A lot of young people could do that way better than these sponsored monsters that we send to Congress. Yeah, they're paid by corporations. Right. I don't need that in my life. I don't need someone who has that influence on them voting for me. That's crazy to me that we allow that.
Getting back to another issue that you talked about, which ties in with this, when it comes to our education system, your critiques of capitalism are integral because you think, and I agree, just to be clear, that our public school system, which we both support the idea of government-sponsored public education. The problem is what our children are being forced to learn, and the reason, the impetus, the motives for why they're being forced to learn. And help me here and cut me off in a second here. But the idea is kids go to school with the goal that they will get educated so that they can go out in the world and they can be a productive member of society. And we give them this kind of narrow margin of skills that they can use, but it's unquestionably so that they can go and make a living for themselves and, quote, live the American dream, whatever that bullshit is. But that's in your world and in your society, it would be completely different. You question the motive of itself of education in America.
Well, I don't know. The rhetoric doesn't sound that bad, that different from what I want to do. I want to actually make people prepared for the world that they're going to find. But I also think that the way you really do that is give them the skills to design the world that they're going to find. And that's nowhere in the skill set that's shared with us. We aren't at any point given the tools that we need to analyze what's going on, to have a critical outlook on society. That stuff is just skipped over throughout most of our education in favor of memorizing things that don't really connect to the last thing you learned about it. Like it just is such a haphazard way to learn things that I'm not interested in at the time, but the teacher's deciding that's when I learn it. This year, this part, this chapter, this way, this film strip. I mean, that to me is just so unnecessary now. Look what's out there. Yeah, exactly. We don't need film strips anymore. But I mean,
they don't have them anymore.
I get it. But that's the point. But the point is there's so much out there now, and there's so many ways for kids to educate themselves and each other. That was a thing I was involved in. I went around to schools that were organized by kids who had dropped out of high schools and were doing not homeschooling, but what they called unschooling in the mid 90s. That was a part of my life. There's so much here that we skip. Like I hitchhiked 25,000 miles around the United States, giving workshops and hanging out with young people and doing activism.
I've never heard that word, but I like it a lot. Would unpack it?
Well, it's pretty cool. There's a lot to it. There's a bunch of that's where you'll find more of the youth liberation stuff. I was writing straight political youth liberation stuff, but around education, there's always been a rich supply ever since the early part of the 20th century. In fact, there's been a lot of really good theories out there for really radical education. Actually, quite a bit earlier, actually. But this idea of unschooling was a kind of 80s and 90s type thing, when there wasn't a left really to speak of during this time that could create a foundation for these types of things. It was just young people kind of out on their own without a lot of resources. Getting adults involved in the community to help teach them stuff, but the kids were organizing it, and it was really cool. They were doing the subjects that they wanted.
Your theories about youth liberation or giving young people more responsibility are far more palatable today, or more possible today, because all one has to do is look at children, their own children.
Yeah.
You can, if you're interested in anything now, you can learn it online, on YouTube, anywhere. Yeah. You can become an expert. You could arguably get a college education in a year of watching and researching things online. And so there's so much more opportunity to quench your curiosity for whatever your passion is. Everything is niche. No matter what you're into, you can find that, and you can find a community that shares that interest. So now, there's a lot of really interesting ideas that are percolating about how, you can have more informal education and how kids can search out and seek out and pursue. I just wanted to sound smart by saying it 3 different ways. Things that they have an aptitude for, things that they have an interest for. Yeah. We did not have that. You had like zines and Xerox copies and old school. Your propaganda that you were using in the late 80s and early 90s is the same they used in Poland.
I believe that's true, yes. I think we learned some lessons.
Yeah, the underground during World War II. It was no different. All the strategies were the same. Yep. All the technology was pretty much the same.
It's real different now.
So now, I'm surprised, maybe it's everywhere and I just am not seeing it, that we don't see more of a disruption in kind of the formal way of education, whether it be public schools, much less, and more importantly, secondary education.
Yeah. That it's out there if you look for it. There are still people doing this. It does seem like it's less frequent than it was even in the 80s and 90s, and that weirds me out because of exactly the reasons that you're saying. I don't know well enough what's going on, but I think that we are still ripe for young people to look at the way that we're teaching them and the way they're being forced to learn and to check out and decide like this isn't going to be it. I feel like I hear that a little bit more than I did even naturally back then. Like kids are kind of aware, like they're pretty aware that there's a lot of BS going on, that we're not very confident that the previous generations aren't very confident that they're going to do well, that the studies don't say that they're going to do well. I mean, there has been
what meant?
By the measurement of having security in the form of wealth, which is something that is unfortunately necessary in this country. To have stability in this country, you have to have equity.
Any country.
Right. Yeah. In a capitalist society, not the country that I spend my mind in several hours a day.
Right.
But yeah, right. In this country and everywhere that's really kind of known, wealth is, but the bigger the social safety net, the less true that is. So I think it's probably the only way to guarantee real stability in a lot of places. But as long as civilization stays intact in, Northern Europe and much of Europe, like those folks are going to be okay, for the most part in ways that we can't feel confident in.
Don't you think that the most obvious issue in America that's so much different than the rest of the civilized world is access to health insurance, thus health care, affordable access? Don't you think that there is a complete difference of psychology and a feeling of safety and confidence that if you live in Canada, Israel, Australia, France, UK, Japan, almost every country in the world, that if you lose your job or if you have an accident or get an illness, it will not destroy your family and everything that you've worked for. isn't that more uniquely American than almost anything else, including guns and capital punishment?
Because of how much wealth we have and how unnecessary that is. I don't know. I don't try to create hierarchies of like what's wrong or whatever. I sometimes can see that something is clearly bigger than something else, but I do agree with you. And this is some point that you've always made on the show. That's a moral litmus test that we can really get down to brass tacks in. You've always been right to put that up front and go, hey, you know what? I don't know you that well. How do you think that people should have healthcare? You don't care, because we're going to learn a lot about somebody from that. So what it means as a nation to me is like, it's something that we all understand that we could do right and we choose not to. So, would I probably choose for myself continuing that we keep bombing the hell out of other countries and killing hundreds of thousands of people in some cases? I think that's a bigger moral crime and a uniquely American thing at this point.
That we're actively killing other people.
Well, we have, and that we haven't adjusted for it, right? We haven't, let's just be clear, whether we did Iraq War or not, we didn't do anything about it. So we're about to do that again, as far as I know. And I haven't heard from anybody else that we have a real guarantee that we're not going to go to war and kill hundreds of thousands of people on a whim like we did then. It's not like we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or held anybody accountable for it. So yeah, I always operate on the assumption that we're the country that does that. So, not giving ourselves health care, that's a different thing, because I don't have to have this whole conversation about war with someone before that, because we're having that healthcare conversation as a country, and we do not have the war conversation as a country ever, ever, ever. During the lead up to that war that we both saw as a crime, 1% of the appearances on the network TV shows, news TV shows, were anti-war. Only 1%. That's according to Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. That's preposterous. I mean, you can't have a national conversation like that. However, on healthcare, it is a much more open conversation. People have heard the sides. If they can't have a clearly moral position on that, I think I know where they stand.
So what do you hope that if people read your book, President's Prologue, which is not a book, it's a novella.
It's a novella, but it's a book. You can buy it as a 100-page book that Amazon will ship to your place. What
do you hope people get out of it, if anything? Do you want it to be the blueprint for the revolution you've wanted to see your whole life?
It isn't that, but
are any of the characters based on you?
Yeah, all of them. All of them have a little bit of me in it because I don't know how else to do it. Right. I really have like these sort of 6 characters that you sort of meet and get to know it all in this story, and each one of them definitely has a piece of me in it. But the narrator, look what this is a narrator writing a memoir in 2046 and looking back at a revolution that he took part in that started really around 2022. And he's looking back on that 25-ish year period of his life right now when I'm looking back on the 25 years since, I got a bunch of tattoos and went to a bunch of conferences and became kind of radicalized and changed my whole world around. Maybe that was a few years earlier than that, but 25 years of writing about youth liberation and thinking about youth liberation. That was exactly this summer. So to me, this whole story has been looking like, how would someone in 2046 look back on a successful revolution if they were kind of at the center of it by accident? So that's my main character. That's the story I want to tell. But what I needed to do, because I'm me and I've been trying to write a novel my whole life, I've been trying to write fiction and publish it. I've written, I've published a bunch of nonfiction, not whole books, but I've been published in other books or in lots and lots of articles. But I wanted to finish a piece of fiction that I felt good about. And so I put a ton of foreshadowing that is about that future revolution that happens in the 2020s into this book so that it's my thing that I've contributed to the world. I may not be able to afford to write the rest of the book, but if I can't, my ideas are kind of out there. They're sort of embedded in this story, the way he foreshadows a lot of what will happen in the 2020s. Because he's talking to an audience that would know in the future, that would have a similar analysis to me in my world, right? So he gets to explain to his future reader from that perspective that lets my current day reader know, hey, here are my radical analysis of why we would have a revolution right now. So I slip it in through that narrative construct. Let me move on just in case anybody cares about, like the actual significant idea that I have around this. There's 2 factors that are coming up in the main novel, which I believe are 2 keys to real democracy in the United States. And one is youth liberation. One is young people saying, hey, we know better about the future and we have to live it. And you people have screwed it up and your democracy doesn't work. And so in my story, they proclaim that everybody 25 and under gets a say in the future. And when you're 25, you're out. And that would have a radical shift in just how progressive and how future oriented, which is how these kids look at it, our electorate would be. And they wouldn't be an electorate, they'd be performing some kind of direct democracy. And the other thing is this blockchain technology, this distributed ledger technology that is going to allow these really powerful flat organizations to emerge probably in the 2020s. And I'm predicting that that's actually going to become a real thing. People will organize that way. I'm creating this thing called Undernet that's going to first I'm creating a fictitious organization, a blockchain, like a distributed autonomous organization, as they call them, that is first, it's an opponent to Uber, basically. It's how could drivers cut out the profiteer and run a system in a distributed, decentralized, democratic way that, basically is like a cooperative for ride shares. And they start radicalizing, they start taking over, like saying, we don't need any of these things. Facebook, Amazon, like there's all kinds of ways that we could start to encroach on these domains with this radical technology that's very real and exists today. It's
perform the services that they all perform, but without it being a centralized for-profit.
Exactly. And without relying on centralized computing, which is key. So decentralized computing means you don't need one organization that is the authenticator that controls the central database like Facebook does. It's everybody's phone has a part of the key to this network, or everybody's home laptop, or whatever it's going to look like.
So we're all Microsoft
generating democracy on a shared basis, right?
It's not Apple's operating system. It's not Facebook. It's one platform that everybody has equal access to, and it's not
it's
controlled.
Our social operating system. It's our societal operating system that we begin contributing to. We redesign an economy in here. We make decisions in here. We create a distributed realm in here.
How come that's not? Is that an original idea? I mean,
no, I have a bunch of original ideas that I bake into here, but there are a lot of people talking about blockchain applications this way. There are several countries
that have. What does blockchain mean?
Well, blockchain is it's a specific way that this distributed ledger technology says, look, what it is we're all going to decide that we're going to share the contents of a database among all of our devices. Now, the contents might be encrypted. That's an option. And that's, of course, what we would want to do with a lot of the contents of a database that ran a society, because you have private information in there. How you voted might still be encrypted, but you can have people vote in a encrypted manner and know that one person, one token, one vote, that kind of
thing. How do you prevent it from being corrupted?
Well, that's the beauty of it. That's the whole point, is that it's uncorruptible. So this is the basis behind Bitcoin. So Bitcoin it works today and is uncorruptible precisely because everybody has a piece of the ledger and all of these computers have to agree of what's going on in this ledger. So you can't really attack that kind of network. Not entirely true. China could probably do a tremendous amount of damage in a distributed network, but if your network was really nation and location based, other countries would have a very difficult time penetrating that. So we want to have a one person, one node on this network type democracy.
You agree the Chinese government is more immoral than the American government?
I mean, I suppose in most ways, yeah, I guess. I don't think they imprison as many people as we do for as low a crime. So I don't know. I mean, I don't do that, I guess. I don't care. I'm paying taxes to this country whenever I make any money, and I'm just really concerned about what we do. China is going to turn around on most of these things eventually, probably without us doing much about it. I don't know how I could ever affect anything in China, but could I do a lot of stuff here if we could get my ideas going?
That's funny because I'm glad I asked you that, because the argument that I hear a lot from people, stay with me on this, from listeners over the years when I criticize Christianity, specifically for something like homophobia or anything about Christianity, the argument that I hear so often is, why don't you ever talk about Muslims and the horrible crimes that they commit and all the things that's wrong with that religion? And I generally say because they have no power here, because this is a Christian country. Our government is dominated by, at this point, it's not, there's some Christians in there that are comparing saying Trump is equitable, like Jesus. It's so crazy, and they have so much power. There is like one Muslim in Congress, and she's not legislating based on her religion in any way. She's really not. Only one is even very religious. I think Ilhan Omar. I think Rashida Tlaib is not even really religious. I think there's 2 Muslims, or maybe there's 3. The point is, there's no influence from Islam in our government. Yeah. And so my point is, when you say I'm not thinking about China and their kind of police state and their human rights abuses because I'm an American, I'm not thinking about Islam because while there's millions of Muslims in America, they're in power.
Well, I mean, and I don't mean to say I'm not thinking about it. I mean, I follow news. I see the world news. I feel for people, and I would, but I feel for so many people in all these places that has so much more to do with us. Yeah. But I certainly feel for people jumping off of the roof of a factory because they're making an iPhone. Like, we're not. It's not that we're not related and we're not involved in the horrors, but. We didn't structure their system. They're certainly controlling the structure of their system. Yeah. We are going around structuring a whole lot of other people's systems, including throughout Central America. And now all those people running up as refugees because their economies are trashed by us. To me, that's literally, not literally our own backyard, but it's figuratively in our own backyard, and they are real refugees, partly caused by our actions, partly climate change, and partly the messing around that we did in those globalization days to destabilize their economies so that we and our companies could get more out of them, so that profiteers could get more out of them. And here's what we see from that. This is the chickens coming home to roost. I know that I want to call people chickens, but that's I don't know. It's a Malcolm X saying, but this is what we get. We reap what we sow, but we're not taking care of these people after we cause them to have to flee their homes where they don't actually want to flee.
Right.
And I'm not saying that we're 100% responsible for that, but we're much more directly responsible for so much of that stuff than we are for China.
Go to Amazon, look up Brian A. Dominick, and buy Present as Prologue, a Gen Zero novella. Brian is on social media.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter I guess you can do that.
At Brian Dominick, and Facebook as well, even.
I'm going to get off Facebook again. That's deadly to me. We could have a whole other, we could do an hour on Facebook.
It's like, it does seem that I hate the promotion part of anything. The idea that I have to do so much more promotion now for the podcast than I did at SiriusXM.
No, I can see that.
It's not fun. You don't feel great about it, but you do have to use social media. It's very difficult to promote anything without using Facebook and Twitter specifically.
Well, I'm having a difficult time with it. We'll see what happens, but right now I self-published this thing because I had to get it out in 2019. That's when it takes place, and it means, because it's literally a prologue to a story that I wouldn't want to start in 2022, that I want to spend the next 3 years writing and releasing, and maybe with a real publisher. I wanted to get this out, show the world that I have this idea that I can kind of write, and put a story together. I think it's good. I really do. I'm proud of it.
Since you were third grade.
Yeah. Well, this is me finally having something that I feel confident saying in a story. And to me, this is what I'm going to do from now on. I'm going to sit here and make non-fiction arguments with you sometimes, maybe, but for the most part, I'm telling this story, and this is how I want to relate to the world. People keep saying everywhere I look, people are saying it's narratives that make a difference. It's not arguments. It's not facts. And that's what I found. I ran a news organization that was hyper-focused on truth and accuracy and put all of this effort into doing it that way. And no one really cared that much. But I do see people responding to stories, and I do have an imagination. So I'm going to give that a try. It's kind of the opposite of what I did for all those years as a journalist.
Well, we'll keep the conversation going. This is fun. I really enjoyed it.
It was fun, yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you want to know where so much of my moral conscience and my ideas come from, I think you probably know now. That's my big brother, Brian. So, what did you think? I'd love to hear from you. Pop me an email, standupwithpete@gmail.com, and get the book Present as Prologue, a Gen X novella, or review it or like it on Facebook and Twitter. Look him up, Brian Dominick. Amazon is where he is selling it, as much as he doesn't want to. and definitely let me know what you think. Thank you so much for joining me and my brother today. And if you want to hear more of these kind of long-form conversations with original thinkers, I'd love to hear from you on that. Of course, support the podcast and me on Patreon, patreon.com/Pete Dominick. Thanks for listening to this very special episode, and I hope you get to have a similar conversation with your sibling. I know a lot of you are like, yeah, that's never going to happen, but maybe some of you will. Or maybe you can't because you don't have a sibling, or maybe they're dead. And now I'm depressing everybody at the end of the conversation. Oof, I stink. And today's episode was brought to you by the 80s, the 90s, and half pipes. Please subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and we will talk to you tomorrow about authoritarianism. Yay!